lost your mind? What is yarn lasagna? I'll get there. I'll get there, I promise. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we are gonna layer yarn and dye and more yarn and dye and more yarn and dye to create this yarn casserole to dye multiple skeins of variegated yarn in one steam pan. This is a technique that I did in Hanukkah 2022, and the chat decided that it was a yarn lasagna or a yarn kugel. So if you've seen yarn lasagna comments before now, this is the technique that everyone is referring to. Sometimes when I'm dyeing variegated yarn, I like to start cold with no acid and apply dried powder directly to the yarn, dissolving it on the yarn itself to get more soft colors with still some variation in there. I prefer this to using a liquid dye on the yarn because it makes it easier to add a lot more color without adding more volume of water, keeping each of the color segments sort of in their relative position. But it can be slow going, and if you want to start with a cold pan, then it's harder to reuse the same dye bath over and over. Typically, I can fit 300 grams of yarn in a pan to get really good coverage. Some techniques, I prefer to use 200 grams. There's other techniques like with twisted skeins when maybe I can do 400, but with this technique, I've done 800 grams of yarn all in one pan and had amazing coverage. Now today, we're gonna just dye 600 grams of yarn in one pan. But it did work for 800, and so I'm hoping that we get great results today because this is the second time I'm trying it. Before we jump in to see our color palette, I want to give a huge shout out, thank you, and happy birthday to our lab partner, Kimberly. Kimberly, thank you so much for being my lab partner today. I really hope you're gonna love this yarn, and happy birthday! If you at home would like to learn about how you can become a lab partner, get yarn dyed in a video, and shout outs in that video, you can go find more information in the listings in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop, and I'll have links down in the video description. I think the first time I tried this technique, I used teal, bright aqua, and navy. And I'm sticking with cool toned colors today, but I wanted to pick different colors to try this out. So we're gonna use Caribbean blue, extreme blue, and intense iris. This is gonna be a very blue palette. The intense iris is very like blue as a purple, but is still much more purple than say a navy. It's a great blurple. Part of the reason why I picked these three colors is that they're colors that are fairly pigmented, but also colors that don't necessarily strike to yarn extremely quickly. My tap water is slightly acidic, so with some colors, I might see colors bind to yarn without adding other acid, which is another reason why I think it's handy to do this kind of dyeing with dry powder instead of using liquid dyes, because when you pour liquid dye onto yarn, it's hard to get it to move through more of the layers. But the process of dissolving the dry dye powder and massaging the dye through with your hands really does help make it go further. And so I'm optimistic that this is gonna work as well as it did the first time. Today we are gonna dye some Knit Picks Swish DK yarn. This yarn is 100% superwash merino wool. It's a DK weight. I dye it all the time. I have it here pre-soaking in some plain tap water, and I think it's pre-soaked for a couple of hours. If you are doing something variegated and you want more full coverage on your yarn, you do want to make sure that it has been very well pre-soaked, because if there's dry patches, those aren't gonna necessarily soak up dye as easily. Now with Swish or Stroll, which is another common yarn base I use from Knit Picks, those two bases soak up water really, really fast. So a long pre-soak isn't as necessary as maybe it would be on a, say, silk blend or something like that. If you want to learn more about Swish or Stroll, I do have Knit Picks affiliate links down in the video description. We will have a yarn mop today, which is a 7th skein of Swish DK. I have not pre-soaked this in acid because I want, if I wipe my gloves on here and then go back into our main pan, I don't want to be introducing acid into our yarn today. And now I'm going to set up the dye bath starting with 200 grams of yarn. Now, one reason why sometimes I like to dye 200 grams of yarn is at a time is that it means you can really spread it out and get much better coverage on the yarn. When there's 300 grams, things are more compressed, and so it's harder to get things on the bottom layers. So today we're going to be dyeing 3 layers of 200 grams. Now I want to be able to work the dyes through the yarn, so I'm going to add some water, but just enough water. And so maybe this was about 4 cups, approximately, approaching a liter of water. And so you can see that there's enough water in here so that way I can squish the yarn and therefore move the dye through, but there's not so much water that when I move the yarn to the side, a ton of water comes out. And so that's important, especially for this first layer. I'm gonna add a tiny bit more water because in this layer, I might choose to flip the yarn and we don't want the colors to run all over the place. But now I'm gonna go put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves so we can start dyeing with the powder. We're gonna start with our brightest color, the Caribbean blue, down here. Now, the color I'm hoping to get is something a little bit more like frozen, a bright blue, but I don't need it to be super, super concentrated. So I'm starting off by just speckling this dye over. And then we're going to come in and start working it through. Had I gone for frozen blue, that would have meant that we would have had the color strike really fast. I don't know if it's the same pigment, but the downside of frozen blue is that I don't think we would have been able to spread it as much as we are right now. And I can move the yarn sort of back over itself to try to like work this color through, because you can see as I'm squishing, we still have color in there. So there's that chance for us to move it through this area. And we really did not add very much of this color at all. And so those whiter patches are slowly, with time, getting more color. And so I might still add more color down here in this section, but I think I'll probably wait because maybe we'll flip everything for this first layer. As we add more and more yarn, they'll also be more liquid, and so it'll be harder to necessarily flip the skeins. But we'll talk about that when we get there. Okay. I do have a paper towel. After wiping the dye off on my yarn mop, I'm using the paper towel to dry my hands before we go into our next dye color. All right, and so this is extreme blue. And I'm also coming over right away to this intersection. And we can layer the color on multiple times if we end up wanting it darker. But I still have dye on my fingertips as I come over to start working it in. And at first, I'm going really, really lightly. But yeah, extreme blue lives up to its name. And you can see that I did splash it up over there. There is going to be a softness to the way that these dyes kind of blend together, and especially as we work on the other layers of color. But this is great. Now, if I just stopped right here, we probably would not have enough coverage because you can see that we still have white there. So we are going to need to work these colors through, but for some reason I find this easier to do with the powders, because if I wanted more color and I poured on more liquid dye, then what would happen here is that we'd end up increasing the volume more and more. And I am seeing a little bit of splash of this color onto this section, which it's going to be a bit of a deeper color anyway, so I'm just spreading out those oopses a little bit so it's less obvious, but trying to use care, but also trying to get good coverage and minimal white patches. That's the goal. The goal is to minimize the amount of white that we have in here. And so now if I go and I look and I flip it a little bit, you can see we've got better coverage, but not perfect. Not perfect. I think this first layer we will flip. Okay, and I'm going to dry my hands and we're going to do the third color. Now, where this technique saves time is the heating step. And I am a small batch dyer, which means that I have 2 of these steam pans and I have 2 spots on my stove, and I guess technically I have a 3rd spot on the countertop where I can heat set the yarn. If you had, say, a steam cabinet or something and could dye multiple pans of yarn at a time, this kind of technique isn't that helpful. You could set up your colorway, add more water, and then move on to the next pan. This kind of layering that I'm talking about is helpful specifically because I have limited pans and limited space. Okay. Oh, interesting. Okay, so this color initially almost disappeared. That is reminding me a lot of hyacinth. Because when the powder goes in, I was like, ooh, that looks light at first. But actually, you know, that makes sense that this color is doing that. It's going to be much darker, but we're also going to add more dye to this. But there are colors that need heat or acid to really like develop. And so hyacinth is one, but I think the intense iris is another. The other colors I've been very happy with the overall coverage. And not that I'm unhappy with this. It's already starting to get deeper. I just want it to be more intense. So we're coming with more of it. And because we're working the colors through, that was a fair amount of dye, we're not going to end up with getting speckles. But also, when we layer the next layer of dye on top of here, we're going to get some transfer from color of this yarn right here up onto the next skein. And so therefore, I do plan to add a little bit more dye on top without working it through of each of the colors before we add the next color on. But the goal is to get good coverage. And so like with the edge, you can kind of make it in a little ball to help work those colors through. Okay. Now I do think I want to quickly flip this yarn over. And I'm going to do that in little segments just so we can look at the coverage we have on this first side. And part of the reason why this is working as well as it is because we don't have that much water in here yet. So I'm trying to spread things out. And again, if I push, you can still see that we have dye. I think some dye is starting to strike, but you can see the areas where maybe we didn't have as much coverage yet. And so I think what I'm going to do is not necessarily, how are we doing? Add a lot more color onto this side for this first layer, but we're going to be adding color on to start our second layer, which will also help add color to the first layer, if that makes sense. But we're not really seeing any speckles here from this. Okay. And so the plan is to take a little bit of our Caribbean blue, and I'm specifically focusing on some of those areas that needed a little bit more color. And now all of a sudden, this is going to bring a lot of color into our yarn mop, where we didn't really have a lot of pigment before. It was all very pastel. Coming in with the extreme blue. Going a little bit heavier here. We're not getting as much coverage. And I'm trying to work a little bit quickly because I don't want the dye to sit on the yarn too long. We'll see if we end up with some specialties. But I think you can see that our intense iris is getting more intense as time goes on. But the general pattern I plan to follow as we start with the next layer is we're going to add a lot more of the intense iris than we do our other colors. And now I'm going to bring over 200 grams of yarn, and we are going to layer this as best we can on top of our first layer. And it's not going to be perfect, and we will eventually add more water. But now we're going to start working this through. And so this area got a little strangely compressed, but you can see we're getting color working up through this section already. I'm going to dry off my hands, go through the lighter blue, and we will again add some more water. But we're already having some reasonable coverage of these colors. And I think I'm okay going from the lightest blue into our medium color and then over to the darkest, kind of moving it so that way the zip ties make sense. But again, it's so funny how light the intense iris is feeling, at least like right away. Now, there is something you could question, and it's like, oh, can I stop here? Ooh, look, we're getting decent coverage down there. Could I stop here and then like add more yarn and have it get lighter and lighter moving up? Then I don't know. I don't have a good answer for you on that. But I am going to carefully increase the volume of water, so that way the yarn is a little bit less compressed, and you can see that we can use that to help work our colors through. Even though we still have to add more dye. We have still not finished adding dye to this. We just added a little bit to help get us started on the bottom. And so yeah, we're gonna continue. As I layered on more dye, I took care to really work it through. Sometimes peeking under to see if I'm getting reasonable coverage on the layers, but trying to really help push that dye through multiple strands of yarn. So that way we get less of a pastel and we get more coverage of our colorway on here. Once I was satisfied with the color coverage of our second layer, I added a little bit of dye powder onto the top and then brought over our 5th and 6th skeins of yarn, pushing down before adding more water to help work that color through, bring a little bit of that color all the way through the yarn, and then adding a little bit of water so that way it's easier to move things through, adding more dye powder on top and working that through until I was satisfied with the color coverage. And again, if I had many pans and many heat sources, I could do this individually on each pan. This is not saving me time for adding the color onto the yarn itself. What it's saving me is time for the heat setting step and space when it comes to the number of pans. Because where before, let's say I did 300 grams at the bottom at first instead of 200. If I had done 2 pans, that would have been 6 skeins of yarn. Well, now I would have been able on 2 pans to do 12 skeins. And really, there's enough space that I could have done 2 more skeins here. So I could have done 16 skeins instead of just 6. And so that ability to increase the amount of yarn that I'm dyeing makes a huge, huge difference to a small batch dyer like me. One other super key factor to this project is that we have not yet added any acid. If we had acid in the yarn, things would strike faster and we'd be much more likely to end up with some kind of speckles on the final yarn. And so again, the dye pigments that I picked were important for this because there's some pigments that have colors and speckles show up towards the end, like say maybe sage leaf. And so you could get something beautiful with that, but maybe there would still be some speckles on it, which again isn't a bad thing. It's just when you're dealing with your expectations of what you're going to end up with, you need to consider the colors that you're using for the entire process. I don't know if you noticed, but at the end, after I'd finished adding everything, I did one final like push over here, sort of pushing everything this way a little bit, because the place where we're likely to end up with light patches are in this middle interior portion. But if I pick it up, it's really pretty good. It's very, very good. And so, yeah, I mean, we dyed 3 batches of this colorway all in one pan, but we still have no acid in here. And so this is where things start to get a little bit, tricky is not the right word, but dicier. So I'm gonna start adding some acid slowly onto here, trying to the best of my ability, distribute it through. Okay, that's about 5. We're gonna add a 1/6 tablespoon of white vinegar down there. And now I'm gonna work that through the yarn the same way as I did before I added acid. Really just sort of squishing it through and slowly going from our brightest section to our deepest section, because our goal now is not just to spread out the color, but you can see actually some of this color is starting to get a lot lighter, or some of the water, because we've got acid in here now. And so things can start striking to our yarn. Okay, but we do also need to add just more water in general, because right now, if I were to go and try to heat set this, I'd be a little bit nervous about it. I would be nervous because I'd worry about the bottom scorching. So I'm gonna go get some water. And I made a mixture of about 8 cups of water with, now I forget if it was 2 or 3 tablespoons of white vinegar. And I'm adding it slowly to our brightest end. And I'm not gonna add all of it, just some. So maybe I added 2 or 3 cups. And again, I'm working it through and also just sort of bringing that liquid down to the other side. We could still add more liquid, but at this point, I want to wait because I want this to stay where it is. And actually, I think that we're looking a little overexposed on camera. I'm gonna adjust that. This is a bit more accurate of where we are. So I am gonna let the yarn sit here for at least 20 minutes, just on the counter, cool, not moving it. And this comes back to, I think I mentioned this in this video, we only have a very light blue there. The extreme blue has actually cleared a fair amount. We haven't waited any time. And we do still have a reasonable amount of the intense iris left here at the deepest end. I can see with my tap water and with acid, some pigments will start to bind to yarn when things are cold, before even adding heat. And so by letting the yarn sit cold without heat for a little while, this is going to give things an opportunity for some of those dyes to set. So that way when I go and add more water over on the stove, we're less likely to have a ton of spread and blend from like what we have. But you know, we can peek under the layer. We've got gorgeous, gorgeous colors here. So I'll see you in 20 minutes. Have you pre-ordered your mini skein set from the 2023 Spring Mini Skein Mini Series yet? Pre-orders are open and the series starts June 5th, so there's plenty of time to order your yarn so you can unwrap your package and watch exactly how I dyed that set. Each mini skein set comes with 5 20-gram mini skeins on a variety of different yarn bases. There are a lot of options and there's a lot of fun extras in there as well. Plus, there's also some add-on skeins. So if you want even more yarn, there's options for that as well. You can find more information in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. I did almost forget about our darling yarn mop that has absorbed so much color this whole time. I just put a tablespoon of white vinegar on it, and now I am squeezing it, realizing and hoping that there's not a hole in this aluminum pan, because vinegar acid reacts with aluminum, and I would hate if that just dumped color onto our yarn beneath the surface. I think we're okay, but I'm gonna go steam set this for 30 minutes in a steamer basket. All right, it has been 20 minutes, and we still have just a very light blue or no blue down there. I would say the extreme blue is looking very set. And we still have a fair amount of color with our intense iris. So what I'm gonna do now is transfer this over to the stove. And my work surface is protected with a shower curtain. The new one is just way more clear, IKEA. The light is very, very blue over here. But I'm gonna come and add water. And the reason why I did things in this order is that I didn't wanna add more water and then move the pan and effectively let gravity move things around a little more. But you can see now we're starting to have a little bit of some water at the surface. I am going to turn on the heat, and we're gonna add even more water. I'm gonna keep a very close eye on this, because again, I don't want the bottom to get too hot. And so that's why, you know, we're adding even more water. But the other thing we don't want is we don't want this deep purple to go all the way down to the other side and disrupt what we have going on there. So I am going to get some foil. Actually, before we even put the foil on, I'm going to come and wipe these sides a little bit, because you can see that we do have a little bit of some dye powder along those sides. And so we may as well clean that up a little bit now. But then I'm gonna put foil on top, so that way we don't lose a lot of water volume during this heating process. Okay. And I'm gonna reduce, as I step away, I'm gonna reduce the heat to like medium low. So that way, again, it's not gonna be too hot on the bottom. And I'll check in on the yarn every 10 minutes but I'm gonna wait and start the timer for 30 minutes of heat until things are super nice and steamy in there. I've never scorched yarn, and I would really hate for this to be the first time. Now, I have the steam pans that I use from Amazon. I have affiliate links to that down in the video description. But I think that if I were going to go and buy new pans, which I've been meaning to do forever, I might buy some directly from a restaurant supply store, so that way I can get a few more of the features that I want. I want to get a pan that has a still 4-inch deep. I like that depth. If you had a 2-inch pan that a lot of dyers use, you wouldn't be able to layer in this much water. These pans have worked great. I've had them for years. But I want to get one that has a little, maybe 2-inch insert, steamer insert for it. Because then I can play around with some techniques when I don't want to have a lot of water volume, but I still want the steam there and to be able to spread the yarn out. I think that that could be really fun to play with. Not to mention, it would allow me to have a steamer setup with the yarn more spread out. So then maybe if I'm doing some kind of sock blank technique on the countertop, it wouldn't need to be then as bunched up into the steamer basket. So that is also a little plus. And then I also want to get a lid, because then I can have a lid. But in a pinch, foil works great. And so I think at the time years ago when I bought these pans, they were maybe $20 each, and I've dyed hundreds and hundreds of skeins of yarn in the same 2 pans. So yeah, I mean, the main thing from keeping me from buying more equipment is, where am I gonna keep it? Because that's the big problem. That's the big problem of being a small batch dyer at home. Where do I keep all my stuff? But anyway, after the yarn has finished heating for 30 minutes, we will go check in. All right, our 30 minutes are up. We are nice and steamy, and it looks like good amount of our color has absorbed. How are we doing over here? There's a little bit of some intense iris down there, but I'm not gonna worry about that because most of the color is in the yarn. Ooh, what I do want to do though is like get the ties a little wet. So I'm gonna turn off the heat and we're gonna leave the yarn, oh, we're overexposed. That is more accurate with what I see. We're gonna leave the yarn in here to cool. Now, ooh, I do see some lighter patches with our blue. We are gonna have some tonal areas and areas that are deeper and less deep, but that's fine. It doesn't need to be perfect. I'm just so curious to see like how much white we have or don't have. But anyway, I'm gonna let this cool for a while and then we'll remove the yarn so it can cool a little bit faster so we can wash it. Now it is the moment of truth and we're going to remove the yarn and take a look. Ooh, so there are a few lighter patches and I do note there's some areas where we go between the colors a little bit, like there's a rogue like bright blue patch down here in the middle of some of those other colors, but I think that's because of how I layered the yarn on. I think when I was dyeing mini skeins, which are shorter, I had an easier time laying them on top because I didn't have to like scrunch them. And attempting to do that scrunch in the middle was a little challenging. But I mean, we've got really good coverage. I see again a little bit of some patchiness, but there's still blue present. So I mean, this worked so well. And I don't mind having like some of those shifts, having it not be like perfect variegated. I don't dye more repeating colorways like this all the time. And so it's nice to have like the edges be soft, but I mean, I think that this will take a little bit of refining still, but it worked so, so well. So now I'm gonna let the yarn cool off so that way we can go and wash it. And I'm not going to necessarily know later on which skein I dyed first, like the first batch versus the third batch, nor are the partners necessarily going to be kept together. So that'll be just another fun thing for us to see towards the end as well. We are going to wash just 4 of our skeins together, and then I'll wash the other 2 with our yarn mop off camera. One other thing I should note about the technique is that I did get a little bit of dye on my forearms from just like the pressing, and so I think that it could be worth having longer gloves, but somehow miraculously I very rarely end up dyeing my hands. Although today, maybe a little bit. All right, let's see. I'm seeing a hint of some blue in here. I'm not immediately concerned, but we're gonna fill the basin up with some water and a little bit of dish soap. The amount we saw was not extreme, so therefore we don't need to be worried yet. But again, we'll fill this up. All right, let's see how we're doing. You can use a larger volume of water to wash. You could fill up your whole sink or something. But I do it this way so that way we can show, okay, there's a hint of something in the water. Ultimately, that's not bad. This is not massive bleeding given the amount of yarn that we have, especially since there could have been some dye powder that didn't dissolve right away. And so having things fully immersed may help. So what I'm going to do now is fill up this basin completely with water and just let things soak for about 5 minutes. Let's check and see how we're doing. I mean, this isn't horribly surprising given that there was a little bit of color around the intense iris. And again, this is so, so light compared to what we have going on. I'm expecting it to sort of resolve relatively quickly. If it was getting a lot worse, or you could see streaks of color coming off of the yarn, then I would be a lot more concerned. But let's do one more wash. And we'll see how we're doing. And I think it's already looking a bit better. Started filling the basin up a little bit because sometimes there's some reflection from like what I have next to the sink or the window or my shirt, and that can make a difference. But aha, we are looking really, really clear now. So I'm gonna put the yarn through my spin dryer, hang it up to dry. We'll wash the rest of the yarn off camera and come back and look at all the yarn laid out together. Here are the 6 skeins of yarn that we dyed all in one pan. And oh my gosh, the intense iris is such a stunning, stunning color. At first, it really didn't look like it was gonna have a lot of pigment, but once you get that heat on there, whoo, it is beautiful. Now, of this, we have amazing coverage. There are only a couple of spots where I felt a little bit more white, and I've tried to have those more on the surface so that way they could easily be seen. Now, because of our technique, within each individual color, there is some tonal variation there. But honestly, I really like that. I like that more than having it be really smooth and even because the yarn is hand dyed. And so having that extra variation is one of the benefits of creating variegated yarn with a hand dyeing method. The one other thing I really want to note is that there's 2 skeins. I think it's this one, maybe right here, and this one right here, where we have some deep blue and then it goes into the light blue again before continuing the deep blue patch. And I think that those might have been that second layer, potentially, and so I didn't really think about how to lay the yarn down when I usually scrunch it vertically in the pan, because I think the first time I did this, I used mini skeins, which are a lot shorter in length, and so those didn't require the same kind of scrunching. It's really important to note that we do have dye lot differences from within the same pan, and likely within the same layers, because we didn't apply exactly the same amount of dye to the exact same amount of yarn for each of the colors. There's some variation and variety in there. This is something that should make somewhat intuitive sense, but I want to mention it to hammer it in that if you were going to try to use one of these colorways for planned pooling, it wouldn't be the best choice because over time the amount of stitches you have of each color might vary, and so doing some kind of mathematical application with the yarn and then expecting that to be the same on the next skein might not be that good. And I don't know if I'm ever going to do this, but if you were going to try to dye yarn for planned pooling, you would want to make sure that you have really good precision on the lengths of your different color sections, and so you wouldn't want the skein to be scrunched up at all while you're dyeing it, because you would want to try to have as reproducible a colorway on multiple skeins as possible versus having it be really, really close but maybe not exact. This is not me hinting that I'm going to do planned pooling. Really, it's not. I have no plans to try to do some yarn like that because for me, the type of yarn I like to dye is more free-flowing. I love to create random colors and combinations. And dyeing a colorway like this that's more repeating is still fun, and I used a very me technique for this, whether or not we're lasagnaing it in the pan. We do have a stunning yarn mop from today. And this yarn has more random color placement. It is a lot less planned. It would knit up probably without a lot of pooling. The other colorways likely will have pooling depending on what you're making with them. And I don't know, I think that the randomness is something that I am personally drawn to working with more. However, I do enjoy dyeing both types of colorway. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I want to wish our lab partner Kimberly a very, very happy birthday. Kimberly, I really hope that you've enjoyed watching this video and that you're going to have a lot of fun playing with your new yarn. If you would like to learn more about how you can become a lab partner like Kimberly, go and check out the listings in the video description that are to the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. While I can't necessarily guarantee a particular date for a video, if you reach out to me enough in advance, then I can try to have the video come out around a particular date. But please message me on Etsy before checking out so that way we can talk about the availability of my schedule. Kimberly, thank you again. I am so happy with this color combination. I knew I wanted to create something where the colors would sort of blend into one another really nicely, but I also wanted it to be different from the colorway I did at Hanukkah. And yes, there's some similarities because there we did, think bright aqua, teal, and navy, and so we have a bright blue, a medium blue, and a deeper color, but it's different. Please let me know in the comments below if there's color combinations you would like to see me use for this kind of technique in the future. Thank you so much for watching.